ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Shocking evidence, jury drama and witness cross-examinations. The Mushroom Case Daily podcast took you inside one extraordinary trial. And now we're back with The Case Of, where we report the in-depth detail of how Australian criminal courts work and who's in there each week. And we're starting with the case of the croc wrangler, Matt Wright.
Mr. Wright denies any wrongdoing.
To hear more, search for the new podcast, The Case Of. It's on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
In the skies above Europe, there's been a worrying trend in recent weeks, with Russia violating the airspace of a growing number of countries. Donald Trump thinks NATO powers should just shoot down the Russian aircraft. But what's the better option? Today, Max Bergmann from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies on what Vladimir Putin is up to and what Europe should do about it. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Max, in the skies above Eastern Europe, there really has been some rather worrying developments over the past few weeks. The UK and Germany have even been sending fighter jets into the skies, haven't they? Just tell me about that.
Yeah, it's been, I think, a very concerning week where it's pretty clear that Russia seems to be probing Europe quite aggressively.
European leaders have condemned what they describe as an unprecedented attack by Russia after drones were launched into Ukraine's neighbour Poland.
Drones were flown over Copenhagen airport for hours on Monday, halting flights and leaving tens of thousands of passengers stranded.
Estonian authorities say the planes were spotted near the island of Vainlu in the Gulf of Finland. Estonia has called for urgent talks with its NATO allies.
I don't love it. I don't love it when that happens. It could be big trouble.
Well, Max, this really began when Russian drones entered Polish airspace. So just remind me of that.
There was a wave of drone incursions of these Shahed drones, in which Russia uses to bombard Ukraine, came across the Polish border. Now, there have been incidents of this in the past where Russia basically just loses control of a drone. It just keeps flying until it runs out of juice and ends up somewhere in Europe. But in this case, it looks rather intentional, i.e. that Russia was sort of poking Poland. And then there was also an incident a few days later where a Russian drone flew over Romanian airspace. And so it looks like Russia is dialing up its pressure on Europe and looking to see how Europe is going to respond.
Yeah, so this Poland issue with the drones, there was something like 19 drones.
NATO fighter jets shot several down, the first time the Western military alliance has confronted a potential threat in its airspace.
So, as you say, one drifting off into Polish airspace might be an accident, but when we're talking about so many, there is a thought that Russia intentionally did this.
Yeah, and I think we have to assume that it was intentional. 19 is not, it's not one or two. And they responded by mobilizing their F-16s, getting them up in the air, shooting down a few of them. And this is causing, a lot of steps to be taken within Europe to address what they worry could be an increasing threat from Russia. But it also raises the question of what Europe should do in retaliation for what is an incredibly provocative act by Moscow.
There was, of course, strong reaction against this from NATO country leaders, from officials. They are not happy.
Whether intentional or not, it is dangerous and unacceptable.
With our partners and through our leadership of the coalition willing, we will continue to ramp up the pressure on Putin until there's a just and lasting peace.
It's not just drones either, is it? Because Russian fighter jets, they also entered Estonia's airspace. How concerning is that?
Yes, there was a real violation of Estonian airspace. Now, one of the interesting things is during this war, the violations of NATO airspace have not significantly increased. If anything, I think they've probably decreased. I'd have to go back and look at the numbers from before the war. But, Norway, for instance, they're constantly having to scramble their F-35 fighter jets to deal with Russian aircraft violating or coming close to Norwegian airspace. And, it's not all that different than what China is doing to the Philippines and the South China Sea. It's an effort by, a country that is feeling strong to sort of bully its neighbors, to say, look what we are willing to do. We're willing to be provocative. And what are you going to do in response? And, previous cycles of this, Europe has been firmly backed by the United States. And this again raises the question of what happens if one of these air incidents results in a shoot down of a Russian plane or, becomes kinetic. Then what does Russia do? What does Europe do? What does the United States do? We're in a very tenuous and stressful, I think, period right now when it comes to European security, something that we haven't really seen since the Cold War era.
All right. Well, Max, of course, any violation of a NATO country's airspace, it does raise fears that the conflict could spread further. And Donald Trump, we know, hasn't been doing much to help de-escalate this situation. He was asked if NATO countries should just shoot down Russian military aircraft, and he thought that was a pretty good idea.
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
Well, let's now have a bit more of a look at what's behind all of this, what Putin is actually trying to achieve. And then, of course, whether nations like Poland, like Estonia, and many others are really prepared. What do you think the message is from Vladimir Putin? Is this just a test of some sort, is it?
Yes, I think it is both a test of European resolve and willingness, and to see how does Europe respond militarily, diplomatically, economically. Can Russia just take actions like this and there's sort of no corresponding European response? That's part of what they're sort of probing here. But they're also probing, as I mentioned, the U.S. resolve and willingness to get engaged. And I think what they saw from President Trump in these latest incidents is the U.S. didn't not back Europe, but it didn't come out strongly and condemn what Russia did. And it's, the United States isn't saying that we're going to come and participate in these air policing missions, which I think would have a real strong deterrent signal. And so I think the danger for Europe here is not that Russia, next month is going to do something even more provocative, send, 35 drones as opposed to, around 20 this time into Poland. I mean, that would be very concerning. I think the larger concern is that where are we in the war in Ukraine in 1 to 2 to 3 years? In 2027, let's say coming to the end potentially of President Trump's term in office. If you're Europe, your fear is, well, maybe round 3 is testing the Baltic states. And, perhaps Russia just decides, you know what? Instead of sending 100,000 troops back into Ukraine, we're going to send them over into Estonia. And then how does Europe and the United States respond? Basically with the premise that the United States isn't going to do anything. And if that's the case, then if Russia's going to make that determination, what it would want to do is start probing, to start seeing, is the U.S. going to do anything? If we send 20 drones into Poland.
All right. Well, Max, given everything you've said, I guess the question is whether the Baltic states or Europe is actually ready for a potential threat from Vladimir Putin. You argue actually now that there really is a case to be made for a European army. Now, that's an idea that has been around for a long time.
It has. It's frequently sort of been laughed aside as sort of being impossible. And I think when we are looking at the moment now where the United States may not want to be permanently based in Europe anymore and is undergoing a force posture review currently at the Pentagon, Europe really needs to think about how it would fight. Because the problem with NATO is that NATO is fundamentally dependent on the United States military, that the Europeans have not integrated on defense. Every other way, when you go into the European Union, you land at an airport, you get stamped. You can travel all throughout the EU and then you leave and you get stamped again, but you could be in a different country. They've integrated their customs and border and they've integrated their economies, their political systems, but not on defense. And the problem is that you have all these different national militaries that have all those different types of equipment. And we've experienced this in Afghanistan, that working with roughly 30 countries is a nightmare. It's just a total logistical nightmare, which means that Europe right now doesn't fight as Europe. So if the United States is not going to be there, then the current structure and mechanisms for how Europe defends itself needs to change.
Although many of these nations are members of NATO, is NATO not the better body to control all of this? It sounds rather logistically difficult to set up a European army at this point. Or you think it can be done?
I think there's not a great option. Conceivably, NATO and an integrated European force are not contradictory, in fact, could support each other. The problem is NATO right now is a total logistical nightmare of all these different countries that all operate in very different ways. And NATO comes on top of all of them and says, okay, we're going to try to figure out how we can actually fight together. And what I'm talking about is something more bottom up. NATO is very top down in that sense. And the problem has been, since the end of the Cold War, is the United States has been firmly opposed to Europeans actually doing this. So whenever the EU would get involved in defense, the United States would come in and say, no duplication with NATO. We did not want the EU to do this because we liked our pride of place inside of Europe. And now the Trump administration has come and says, we don't want to be in Europe. And the Europeans are looking around and realize that they spent the last 25 years not integrating, not working together, and it's going to be a real problem. And it would take probably a generation to really do this, but Europe may not have the time. And so I think there's real steps that have to be taken very urgently by the Europeans, especially if, in the next month or so, there's an announcement from the Trump administration basically saying that they're going to move a lot of their assets back to the continental United States. By assets, I mean both troops and equipment, as well as to the Indo-Pacific. Then Europe, has to it's not just about spending more, it's about how you spend that, and then being sure that they could fight as one. And so I think there needs to be a real effort to think about how Europeans fight. And that's something they just haven't had to think about really for 75 years. And it's really time. I think the thing that we have to understand here is that this would be a long slog. This is not going to be something that can be done in 1 to 2 to 3 years. But the process of European defense integration needs to start now. This is a very messy time in European defense and security, and that's what Russia's probing right now.
Yeah, well, Max, then in the short term, as they're trying to figure out how to deal with this, and Putin is clearly pushing the boundaries and testing Trump's resolve, how is this de-escalated? What can they do?
I'm afraid I think the answer is, unfortunately, they need to sort of escalate to de-escalate. The Europeans have to demonstrate that they are strong and not going to be pushed around, which means taking punitive action back against Russia. And that punitive action doesn't have to be like for like. I'm not advocating sending European drones into Russian airspace. I don't think that would be wise, but there are certain things you could do to really hurt Russia. And the Europeans could start taking, military naval actions. Cyber responses. There are also additional sanctions that could be put in place. And then I think another step is to think about, are there ways that you could start having Russia bleed money again? But there isn't sort of a clear silver bullet of Russia does this, you do that, it sends a good signal, and then everyone just sort of moves on with their lives. This is a very complex diplomatic, military tete-for-tete. It's a very dangerous situation right now. I mean, I think Russia's response and Europe's response thus far have been fine, but there's a lot of criticism in Europe that it hasn't been strong enough and needs to do more. And I think that's probably right, but I think there are also limits to how much you want to make a huge deal of this.
Max Bergmann is the director of the Eurasia Program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC. This episode was produced by Jessica Wukyanov and Sam Dunn. Audio production by Cinnamon Nippard. Our acting supervising producer is Sydney Peat. I'm Sam Hawley. Thanks for listening.